Joe Swinson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it is a particular pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for Scunthorpe, who of course has distinguished ministerial experience in this area, and it's very welcome to have the benefit of his contribution to this debate. Now, there are some who say that these many days of European debates are a little like Groundhog Day, with the same things being repeated over and over again. And I've been a regular attender at these debates, and I like to be a keen observer, but I have noticed there are nuanced differences in the spirit of debate on the different days. Some subjects a little bit more controversial, and others perhaps discussed in a more consensual tone. And I had high hopes that today on climate change we might be erring more towards the consensus, with more agreements than perhaps we have managed so far. The Conservative backbench amendment is clearly ridiculous. To argue that it would be better to remove references of climate change from the treaty just doesn't stack up, and therefore I am very pleased that their front bench has indicated they will not be supporting this later on today. They are right, however, that it is action which is more important than words, but it is not the only thing. I think the political priorities are also sending an important signal, and so it is very welcome to have this in the treaty. But I would say to the Conservatives, they really must recognise the importance of Europe in tackling climate change. And with their anti-European sentiment, they really must recognise they can't have it both ways. I think, from the point of view of the Conservative Party, pursuing the Green Line is all talk and no action. Those are not my words, Mr Deputy Speaker. They're from the former chair of the European Parliament Environment Committee, the Conservative MEP Caroline Jackson. Mr Deputy Speaker, successive treaties have developed EU environmental powers, and quite rightly so, because the global environmental challenges we are facing clearly require international cooperation. So it is very welcome that climate change will be explicitly listed in Article 174, and the environmental objectives will now include promoting measures at international level to deal with regional or worldwide environmental problems, and in particular combating climate change. Now, the House has already had the opportunity to discuss the energy policy changes in the Lisbon Treaty already, but it is just worth reiterating that there are obviously clear advantages for tackling climate change in the new objective for European energy policy in Article 176A to promote energy efficiency and energy saving and the development of new and renewable forms of energy. Article 188 also has an impact on climate change, 188R, the Solidarity Clause, which states that the Union and its Member States shall act jointly in a spirit of solidarity if a Member State is the object of a terrorist attack or the victim of a natural or man-made disaster. Now, the issues about the terrorist attack may have also been covered on a different day, but in particular with reference to climate change, when scientists are telling us that the best realistic hope that we can have is for a 2-degree rise in temperatures, we are clearly going to be having to expect more natural disasters and increasing frequency. So having this solidarity clause is also very welcome. And indeed, as already been mentioned, the EU will be able to play an important role in adaptation, because as the science gets better, we will be able to see the areas where that 2-degree rise is going to have the biggest impact and where we need to take action. I'll certainly give way to them.
I'm delighted to hear her talk about adaptation, which doesn't get talked about enough in this House. Is she, like me, surprised and saddened that the Conservative frontbench spokesperson never mentioned it in 30 minutes on his feet?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman makes a very important point, and we do need to look at climate change in the context of both mitigation and adaptation, because the science is telling us that some level of climate change is now inevitable. Obviously, mitigating that and keeping it as minimised as possible is important, but many communities, and particularly we're talking here on an island, coastal communities, but many others will also have to bear the impacts of this.
For the Honourable Lady giving way, to back up the point she's making, it's not often understood that of the 2-degree, we've already got 0.7. We're already down the track that far, so she's absolutely right. Yeah.
Absolutely, indeed. The environment being confirmed in Article 2C as a shared competence is also something which is very welcome. Of course, the UK must preserve its right to act on environmental matters, but we also need EU-wide action, and so this is exactly the kind of area that should be a shared competence. I'll give way to Honourable.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and like the member opposite, I applaud her raising the issue of adaptation. And I know that she is aware that funding for adaptation in the developing world is currently running at around £37 million a year for the whole world from the CDM, when the estimates are, just in the developing world, that 1,000 times that. between 30 and 60 billion a year is required in order for the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world to be protected against climate change, which is already inevitable. And if the EU is to make sense of this, if this treaty, which I hope might make a difference, who knows, then we need to see from the Secretary of State and other ministers, we need to see adaptation raised up and we need to see funds appropriately allocated.
And the Honourable Gentleman does make it indeed a very good point, and I may also say a very good case for a stronger Europe able to take action on this issue. Turning to the issue of the European Union ETS, which is the single most important development in tackling climate change for the UK, for Europe, and arguably so far as a bit of a pioneer for the rest of the world. Emissions trading is clearly going to play a vital role in reducing carbon emissions internationally. Now, Phase 1 has shown how a scheme can be successfully set up and administered with very high compliance rates. What it's not managed to show us yet is how we can actually use it to cut carbon emissions. But it is a step in the right direction, and there are encouraging signs that we are learning from the over-generous allocations in Phase 1, as was also raised by the Honourable Member for East Surrey. So I am optimistic that Phase 2 can make more contribution to emissions cuts. Although I would say it's regrettable that there's a maximum 10% auctioning in Phase 2, when actually we all know that auctioning is far more economically efficient. And it's even more regrettable that the UK will only be getting up to 7% auctioning. So I would urge the Secretary of State and the Ministers to look again at that, and particularly going towards Phase 3 to extend the auctioning to 100%, because this will actually give us the best tools possible and enable to make the scheme effective and pass the price signals on. We've already heard in the debate about the shortcomings of the ETS in the exclusion of aviation and shipping, although welcome that the government at least does recognise that this is something which does need to be pursued. But we should as a House recognise the success of this scheme so far, and the fact that it is being emulated in many other parts of the world. California have certainly looked to it, and indeed the Environmental Audit Committee, several members of whom are here in the Chamber, we recently went on a trip to Australia, and they in fact were telling us how they're currently setting up an emissions trading scheme, using the EU scheme as a model and also learning from our mistakes, and we were able to also enlighten them somewhat on the changes that we would have made. And incidentally, their scheme actually goes somewhat further in terms of the inclusive transport, so countries could hopefully be able to learn from each other on this as well. On Australia, it's particularly pleasing that their decade of climate change denial has come to an end, with the electors deciding to elect Kevin Rudd. And interestingly, perhaps one of the first elections where the issue of climate change was so pivotal in deciding the result, and that may indeed be something which will be a sign of things to come. And they indeed are having their own sort of mini Stern report with the Garneau report, which will hopefully help them to catch up on lost time. The EU has had many environmental successes, and I will just touch on a few of them. Others have been mentioned already in the debate today. The Landfill Directive, with its escalating penalties for sending too much waste to landfill, is driving up recycling rates across the UK, which have really increased in the past few years. And indeed, some of the proceeds from this going to funding community groups, including some in my constituency that have been lucky enough to receive grants. It really was about time that we learned from our continental neighbours, many of whom who have been recycling huge amounts more than us for decades, but better late than never, and we still have a long way to go. The interestingly named WE Directive has been helping to encourage more recycling and safe disposal of electrical goods. There's the EU Energy Label with the A to G ratings on white goods, which has been very successful and making it easy for consumers to know when buying appliances which ones will cost them dear on their energy bills. And the Honourable Member says from a sedentary position and cars, indeed I was just coming on to the directives on vehicle emissions as well. I appreciate that. The phasing out and the ban on leaded petrol and setting standards for acceptable emissions, coupled with the labelling for vehicles on energy use, so that people can see when they're buying a car exactly how much it's going to cost them to run. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I'm very grateful to her, and I agree with very much of what she's saying. But doesn't she agree with me that this latest proposal to force cars to have their headlamps on all the time is utterly ludicrous?
Well, I would say there would certainly be a case for that in some parts of Scotland during the winter months. But I suspect we may be better off encouraging drivers to use their common sense about when it is required. But these changes have also not just enabled consumers to make different decisions, but are encouraging manufacturers to make different decisions about the types of cars that they want to sell. There's also been an international lead, I think, as has already been mentioned, the member for Suffolk Coastal, about how Kyoto may not have been ratified without EU pressure on various other countries, in particular Russia. And of course the EU was a key player at the recent Bali conference, and while it was disappointing not to get carbon reduction targets agreed, we did at least secure international agreements in principle to cuts, and the details will be worked out following further negotiations towards Copenhagen in 2009. I will give way, but I do want to make some progress.
Very quick question to the Honourable Lady. I wonder if she could share with the House one key change, practical change, that will come in European policy on climate change as a result of the Lisbon Treaty.
Well, I don't have a crystal ball, but I certainly believe that it is important for the EU to have this listed explicitly as one of its priorities, and certainly that given the choice between having it listed as a priority or not, I certainly know which way I would prefer. I think it is important if we look at what the EU has been set up to do. In the initial post-war period, the peace and security was obviously an absolutely key driver, but now increasingly this climate change issue has got to be one of the top priorities, and it would just be very bizarre for that not to be listed so in the new treaty. I really do want to make some progress. I do apologise to the member, but I know many other honourable members do want to speak in the debate. We also welcomed the setting of various targets at the March 2007 European Summit, the 20% energy efficiency target, 20% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2020, and 20% of energy to come from renewable sources. But I think we really do need to push to increase these, and the EU has at least said that they're keen to do so to 30% if international partners also do. But when the EU went to Bali and argued for cuts of 25 to 40% by 2020, having only already agreed to 20% ourselves, I think we really do need to recognise the urgency of the issue, and particularly if, as the science is now telling us, 60% by 2050 may not be enough, we may have to go to 80%, then 20% by 2020 does seem a little unambitious and will in fact just lead to much more painful cuts and reductions in the years from 2020 to 2050. Another disappointment that I would say on that 20% energy from renewable sources target was that when Tony Blair signed up to it in March 2007, he did say that Britain should aspire to meeting that 20% target by 2020, but it does seem the government's now backtracked to 15% on that. Britain has huge renewable resources at its disposal, with wind, the potential of marine energy through tidal power and wave power. We absolutely must invest in the research and development to realise that potential and recognise the urgency of doing so and be far more ambitious. If Britain wants to be a leader in this area, we shouldn't be lagging behind our European partners in this issue, with them achieving more than 20% and us achieving less than 20%. But Europe doesn't always get it right, and there's a few areas where I think we should be pushing Europe to do much better. One is an issue I've raised with the Secretary of State before, and indeed in a 10-minute rule bill, which is the issue of excessive packaging, which actually leads to UK consumers paying 3 times over for the ridiculous amount of packaging that surrounds the stuff that we buy. Not only do they pay for it at the checkout, they pay for it through their council tax bills of sending it to landfill, and then they also pay the environmental cost of the gases it gives off and the changes to our environment. It's an EU directive, the Packaging Essential Requirements Regulations of 2003, which governs this, but it really is totally toothless. It was introduced in predecessor regulations 9 years ago, and in that entire time there have been just 4 prosecutions. Trading Standards complain that they have numerous problems with enforcement. So when I raised it last time in the Select Committee with the Secretary of State, he said that the Directorate General Environment was keen to look at reviewing it. I have written to DG Environment for further information about this, but there's so far been no response. I wonder if the Secretary of State might have more luck and be able to help me with more information on that issue. I certainly will give way.
Just very briefly, would you also agree that it's about time we saw some effective action to get rid of the scandalous waste and destruction that is caused by the single-use plastic bags, some 13 billion of which are used and abused in this country every year?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman certainly makes an interesting point, and certainly in terms of litter and the effect on marine life, plastic bags can indeed be a scourge. I think we need to exercise a little bit of caution, because there have been some studies from research from other countries where these have been banned or a tax put on, which actually has led to some unforeseen consequences, and we should be aware very carefully of looking at the research on this. But I take reusable bags whenever I can when I go shopping, and I urge other members to do the same. Another area which has also been mentioned in the debate, which is disappointing from a European perspective, is that of biofuels. And the EU has obviously got this target of 10% by 2020, and in the UK 5% by 2010. This is a very expensive policy, and it has been called into question by a growing body of academics and organisations, not least the Royal Society, the UN, the OECD, Professor King, the government's own advisor, and recently the Environmental Audit Select Committee. Sustainability standards are much talked about, but they are not in place yet. And the evidence that we received in the Environmental Audit Committee suggested that it may in fact be impossible to create robust sustainability standards that would truly capture the problems of land use change and deforestation. The government has been pretty dogmatic in its line that pursuing biofuels is the right way forward. And indeed, in transport questions on the 22nd of January, Hansard column 1351, the Minister told me, "We are convinced that is the right way to proceed." But I am nothing, Mr Deputy Speaker, if not persistent. When I get to the end of the point, I certainly will. I am nothing if not persistent, and so I again raised the issue in business questions last Thursday morning, which is in Hansard column 527. And I was pleased to see on Thursday afternoon at 2:15 p.m. a press release issued by the Department for Transport that the Secretary of State was therefore initiating a review into the indirect impacts of biofuels. It is not often as a member in this place that you get to have such an immediate impact on government policy, but I was delighted that the government is now accepting that there may be issues with biofuels, and when the facts change, then it's also fair enough to change the mind. I do just hope it will be a thorough review, and if necessary, as I believe it will be, lead to the UK changing its policy here and arguing for changes in Brussels. I do want to give way to the honourable gentleman here, and then the honourable gentleman.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way, and I very much appreciate what she's saying. But does she not agree that there has to be a distinction made between first-generation biofuels, which were very dodgy in a sustainability point of view, and second-generation biofuels, which may come from the wood industry and such like? And there is a possibility of making something with second-generation biofuels.
Well, that is certainly true, but they are not currently commercially viable. I think it is important to look at the differences in terms of biofuels. For example, using waste oils to create fuel, which would otherwise just be thrown away, certainly seems a very sensible thing to do. I think the problem I have is with the targets, which could actually hasten the development of biofuels, which perhaps don't meet such robust environmental standards. Well, there may well be interesting research to be done on second-generation biofuels, but we're not there yet. I
thank the honourable lady, and I very much agree with the line she's taking on biofuels. When we're talking about some sort of sustainability scheme, would she agree with me that there's a real problem with displacement? Because we might well get a scheme where we've got a sustainable certification for, say, a palm oil plantation in Indonesia that has transferred to being for renewable fuels, but they then go and develop a new palm oil for the other uses of palm oil, taking up rainforests. So sustainability is a hugely difficult issue.
And the honourable gentleman makes a very important point, and while we took a lot of evidence on the Select Committee about the importance of sustainability standards, and some people were quite optimistic, as some of our witnesses, about how this could be done, I remember vividly the session where we asked that question and we said, if there is a particular field or plot of land that is currently designated as agricultural land, what's to stop them clearing a bit of forest to put food production there and then use the land that was used for food production for the biofuels, so it would actually be masked, and we just could not get an answer from any witness on how you could actually develop a standard that would properly take that into account, which I found somewhat depressing, but perhaps is the reality of the situation. I am conscious that many other honourable members want to speak, so in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would just say that the European approach to climate change is not perfect, and we can and we must work to improve it. But we must also recognise its genuine achievements. Europe is taking a global lead on this issue. And I would actually like to quote from a member who's in the Chamber, the Conservative member for, Honourable Member for Ruislip Northwood, who has said, getting Europe to work on climate change would be helping the EU redefine its relevance to a new generation. I totally agree with that. This is the biggest challenge that we face. It's in all of our interests to work across Europe and internationally to rise to meet this challenge.